To preface this, I want to say last year I spent about 32 days in the woods, either scouting, hunting, or fishing. The year before that, I spent about 22 days. This doesn't include my regular hunts and camping adventures, which in the past 3 years adds up to just over 100 days. I've been hunting since I was 9, and have spent a lot of time outdoors, in various different parts of the USA and in Canada. I've seen and heard a lot of strange shit, but this one takes the cake. I was in Cohutta, North Georgia wilderness, for 7 days scouting for bears, wild hogs, and deer, prepping for a hunting trip later that year. I had hiked in about 10 miles, and then went off trail for another 3 to 5. Basically, I was out in the middle of nowhere. Since I was alone, I was using a hammock that has a built-in bug net, and I had a rain fly over it. I spent about 3 days halfway up a mountain, just looking for a good place to hunt. I saw 3 to 4 good-sized bears, about 10 hogs, and ran across a few good-sized deer. On the 4th day, I was going to head down to a small stream that I had marked on my GPS, and then set up camp, restock on water, and prep for the 2-day hike back. I could have gone faster, but I wanted to be able to look for any animal signs along the way. As I was approaching this small stream, I noticed a tent, which I was excited to see, as I had been completely alone for a few days, and it's always nice to run into another hiker. Generally, us wilderness folks are pretty down to earth, and as I got closer, I couldn't have been too far from where the camp was. So I set up my camp about 30 yards away, and with about 4 hours of daylight left, started cooking some dinner. 2 hours later, I started to wonder where this person was, given that I was in the wilderness and it was over a day hike out. There wasn't much I could do, but I did hike around the site, making a circle as I went out, to try and look for any signs of a struggle in case there had been a bear attack, or maybe they had an injury. I got about a quarter of a mile out from the campsite, walking in a circle, and found nothing, much to my relief. As night came, no one showed. I started a fire, in hopes that the person would be able to find where they'd set up, and have some light. Fires burn really bright, and are very easy to see from far away. After eating, searching, and hoping that the person was going to make it back, I called it a night. I had a small flask with me, and took a couple of sips of whiskey, jumped into my hammock with my pistol, and attempted to go to sleep. Now, I sleep pretty hard. I mean, really hard, regardless of where I am. It literally annoys my friends, because I can always seem to fall asleep and stay asleep, regardless of where in the world we are. But this night was different. I felt like something was off, but I figured it was just me worrying about this person, who, by all my accounts, was completely missing. So for the first time in my life, I woke up to the sound of what I thought were footsteps, but not in the sense of footsteps on leaves, but what a heavy-footed person might make walking on an old wood floor. It was extremely loud. I got my gun, grabbed my headlamp, and stored it in a small compartment above me. and waited to see if it would stop. Right at that moment, it did. Then I saw something that scared the shit out of me. On my rainfly, the gleam of a flashlight, faint but there. I shouted, "Hello?" And right when I did, it sounded like 10 people suddenly began running away from me in every direction. I dropped out of my hammock to the ground, grabbing my gun and frantically turning on my headlamp, shining it all around me. But I didn't see shit. My heart was racing pretty badly, but I thought it might have just been the reflection of the moon on the rainfly. Yeah, that was it. And those footsteps running away were probably all the armadillos. As much as I tried to convince myself of my own utter lunacy, the problem was that there was no moon. I'd never seen an armadillo above 2,000 feet, and for some reason, the campsite I set up by was gone. The fire had been put out by water, and it was apparent because there was not a damn coal in that thing. I thought for sure it was 4 a.m, but I had only been asleep for an hour at this point. I wanted to leave, but hiking out in the wilderness while it's dark is always a bad idea. So I grabbed my flask, took a sip of whiskey, removed my rainfly so that I could see out of my hammock, and tried my hardest to go back to sleep. I was laying down when I saw some light hit the tree above me. It was clear it was coming from downstream, and I got out of my hammock and started yelling, "Hey, you need help?" I got no response. I saw whatever was putting out the light, and it spun around and started heading downstream, really fast. At this point, my body had pumped through more adrenaline than it had blood, and I was exhausted from it. I finally was able to fall asleep, and woke up at around 7 a.m. When I did, I noticed that my water filter that I had left out was missing. It's a gravity filter, and it hangs on a tree filtering water down into my main bladder that I put on my backpack, and my water bladder sitting at the base of a tree. It looked like it was cut down the middle with a knife. They cut down my bear bag, which had food in it, and took some of it. The creepiest part of it all was that they went through my bag, which was right under my hammock, while I was sleeping. I checked the bear bag before, and I went back to sleep the second time, and it was still there, hanging, and my bag under my hammock hadn't been touched. I packed all my shit and hightailed it out of there, keeping my pistol close to me and moving as fast as I could. I ended up making the hike back in just under 15 hours. I hiked the trail part in the night, because I wasn't about to spend another night out there. I didn't see anyone on my hike out. There were no cars parked at the trailhead, and the DNR said they had only seen my car there. Since then, I haven't gone out there without any friends. I reported all of this to the local DNR, but they looked at me like I was crazy. About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA County. Bordering my town was a large cavernous region known as Turnbull Canyon. It's the kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area emphatically known as Hell's Gates. Stories of cultic activity, gang killings, abandoned mental institutions, and the like. The kind of shit you hear about any place old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of the stories were spurned from a tragedy that occurred years prior. A woman's body was found at the base of a canyon, and from then on, the rest is history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon with him in order to take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon was only about a 30-minute drive from our campus, and we had been listening to the King of Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambience to get me feeling pretty anxious about our little excursion. I should also note that I'm a pretty anxious guy in general, so travelling out to a remote area, preceded by its reputation for scary occurrences, admittedly had me thinking twice about the decision. At the top of the canyon, there's a small residential area, a few ritzy houses surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture into the canyon itself, you have to follow a main trail, with several smaller arteries that split off in other directions, but ultimately culminate after a couple of miles or so. At the base of a steep hill adorned an old water tower overlooking the city. Anyhow, we parked our car at the top of the canyon road, divided up the camera gear, and made our way out to the trailhead, with it being around 1 AM by this point. After walking the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave the photographer decided it was time to set up his first shot, while Jeff, our other friend, and I kept watch. Eventually he got the shot he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 minutes or so, before Dave decided to set up his next shot. At this point, the trailhead had disappeared behind us completely, and we were a little less than a quarter of the way to the water tower. While setting up the tripod, we noticed the faint glow of headlights off in the distance, which was strange because the trail isn't meant for cars, nor is it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall, it's only about 5 feet wide with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a bit of a red flag for us, as we were the only people out there. So we immediately packed up our things and ducked off into the brush, waiting for the car to pass on. Eventually, an old pickup truck idled to a stop about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis, the bed of which was missing entirely. Growing up in the country, I knew it as the type of truck typically owned by backwoods woodfolk, who lived in the boonies and preferred to be left out on their own devices. We watched in agonizing anticipation as the truck just idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails, the roar of the engine echoing throughout the canyon. Clearly, we were spooked at this point, the three of us speculating as to our next step. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, while Dave assured us that it was probably nothing. Perhaps just a guy off-roading, as he put it. So with great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behind Dave towards the water tower to get his final shots. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading, for fun in the woods, but never on finicky canyon trails barely wide enough to hike on, let alone drive. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for about an hour, we finally made it out to the water tower, climbed the hill to the top, and took in the view of the city. Dave once again started setting up his equipment, while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower, keeping watch just in case the truck came back. Nothing. At this point it was around 3 a.m. and Dave decided that he has gotten all the shots he needed. So we pack up our equipment and commit to heading back before it gets too late. Seeing as how all of us have class in just a few hours, just as we were preparing to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back onto the trail, at which point the driver attempts to climb the hill, revving the engine loudly. Scared shitless, the three of us slid off the side of the hill into the brush, clinging to plants and rocks, as the truck finally made it atop the hill, slowly driving around the tower. We could see the glow of the headlights each time it circled above us. After waiting for nearly 10 minutes, while also trying to not make any noise, the truck eventually descended the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail not more than 100 yards away. We watched as a scruffy man in his mid-50s stepped out of the idling truck and into the glow of its headlights, moseying around while looking at the ground. He then knelt down, looking at something in the dirt, surveying the area intently. As he did so, it became increasingly apparent that he was tracking something. Our footsteps. This next part chills me to the bone. As my friends and I huddled together watching in complete terror, another man, wearing a long, dark parka, emerged from the brush, right there where we had been hiking, joining the other man at his side. Apparently he had been out there the entire time we were walking the trail, just watching us, following behind us at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a long while, but we couldn't hear a word. They continued scanning the area, looking for our footprints, but eventually got in the truck and drove off down one of the forks in the trail. We sat in silence for a long time, waiting nearly 2 hours just to ensure the coast was clear, at which point we made like hell back to the car, down the canyon, and back to our campus, just in time for class. This story happened to me 10 years ago. At the time, I was jobless, and I found a job as a security guard in an office building. But the office building was in a forested area, away from any busy streets, secluded. The person who had the job before me had a car accident, and apparently, and unfortunately, was paralyzed from the waist down. Nobody was interested in the job, since you worked during the night in an office building that was huge, and it was just a boring as hell job. But I needed the money, and a job was a job. Once I started, a supervisor worked me in for a week. So, this was my first night working by myself. I came to work and took the shift over from my colleague at 9 p.m. He told me there were still some people left in the building. Before I went up to the 15th floor, I closed the main entrance in such a way you can only exit when you're inside, so that no outsiders could come in beyond this point. After I did this, I went to the 15th floor where these people were still at work, to ask them if they needed to go anywhere else in the building, because if not, I could make my rounds and close off all the other floors, which I did. So I made my rounds and found nothing in particular. I returned to the front desk, and it was around 11:30 p.m. and the last people who were working on the 15th floor were just leaving. And the last person to leave was a guy who wished me a good night. Once everyone was gone, I went back up to the 15th floor, checked all the offices, and locked it down. I went down to my front desk again, since there were no people left. I turned on the alarms, which work via motion detection, and also when you open a fire exit. I did this on every floor except the ground floor, because that was where my desk was. Within 5 minutes that I activated the alarms, on all floors, the alarm went off on the 10th. There was supposed to be no one in the building. The rule is, if an alarm goes off, you first call the security company before you take any action. I told them I would investigate the alarm and I would call them back once I checked it out. Otherwise, if I didn't call back, they would send a police car to check it out, just as a precaution. I checked the whole 10th floor, and I found nothing. I went back to call the security company, telling them it was a false alarm. I kid you not, the alarm on the 10th floor went off 7 times in the hour, and every time I checked the floor, I couldn't find anything out of order, or even that there was someone there. Since this was my first day working alone, and the alarm went off so many times, the security company just assumed I was screwing stuff up, and wanted to file a complaint to my boss, which would mean I would lose my job that I had only had for a week. Great. In retrospect, the following was the dumbest thing I could ever do, because the alarm went off again. I didn't want to call the security company again and cry wolf. I just went up to the 10th floor without informing them. The only thing I had on me was a mag light, since security guards in the Netherlands are not allowed to carry guns. So I went up to the 10th floor, checked the floor, and as before found nothing. The only difference now was that I pretended to leave, turned off the lights, and stayed on the 10th floor, listening to see if someone was there. In about 5 minutes, I heard someone or something moving. I was relieved and anxious at the same time. Relieved I wasn't wrong, and that there was nothing on this floor, and anxious because of what was on the floor. I turned on the light and tried to sound as manly as possible, saying something to the line of, "I know there's someone in here, show yourself." And as you can imagine, no response. I was so stupid not to go down and call for help. But stupid me went looking to whatever it was I heard on the 10th floor. So I walked into the office that I heard the sound from, turned on the light, and found a little girl who couldn't be older than 13, with long brown hair, in white pajamas, squatting and rocking front to back on a desk, looking straight at me. The scary thing was that there was no emotion in her face nor her eyes, and I was almost shitting myself. This is the typical scene from every film I've ever seen, where the protagonist discovers the horrifying thing taunting him right before his imminent demise. Keeping this in mind, I collected my nerves and took the girl by the hand. Like, what can a small girl do to a 6'8" tall guy? Am I right? No. I took her down to the front desk, offered her a Coke, but she didn't respond at all. The only thing I could do was call my supervisor and told him about what I encountered. My supervisor's response was, "Stay there, we'll be right over." I hung up the phone with my supervisor, and while we were waiting, I just had this feeling from this girl that there was something really wrong with her. Before my supervisor showed up, he called me and told me to call an asylum, which was pretty close to the office building I worked at, just to verify if someone was missing or not. Why would there be a 13-year-old girl in an office building with no houses nearby at all? So that's what I did. I called the asylum and inquired if there was someone missing, and I got the scariest response of all. They told me, yes, as a matter of fact, someone is missing. I gave them a description of the girl sitting next to me, and it was in fact the girl who was missing. They told me that she was extremely dangerous, and that I should watch my back at all costs. They immediately sent people over to take the little girl with them. A week later, my supervisor told me the story of the girl I found, since he spoke with the people from the asylum. It turns out that this small girl killed her mother, her father, and her brother whilst they were sleeping, when she was 11. Even in the asylum, she wounded herself and fellow members of staff, either by stabbing them with a pencil or, in another case, biting a piece of someone's ear off. To this day, we still have no clue how she entered the building. Maybe as someone was leaving, the door stayed open long enough for her to dart in and sneak up through the stairs. Or I don't know. Either way, we checked all the cameras and there was absolutely no footage of her ever entering the building. I lived in New Mexico for several years before moving to the Midwest. My friend Amy and I, who are both females, would spend many days exploring the remote corners of New Mexico, discovering abandoned ghost towns, and enjoying the quiet, desolate beauty of the desert. One afternoon in March 2010, we were traveling from Ruidoso to Albuquerque, always up for exploring. We took a back road rather than traveling the more direct highway. One leg of our journey had us on NM55. It's a remote, teeny tiny 2-lane highway. We loved those type of roads, up until that day. This part of New Mexico is flat and desolate desert. You can see for miles. And there is virtually nothing except dirt and rock between towns, and towns can be miles apart. So we were on NM55 going north, and after a few minutes, we saw a white pickup truck ahead of us going in the same direction. Suddenly, he stopped his truck sideways in the middle of the highway, blocking both lanes. We were about a mile away from him, and as we got closer, we began to get uneasy. We could see no reason for him to do this. We were the only other vehicle out there, and we began wondering if we should turn around rather than come up to him and have to stop. We were about half a mile away from him when he pulled over to the opposite side of the highway. His truck was still pointing in the direction we were going, and we tried to relax a little bit. Surely this guy was a rancher or something. Maybe he was checking something on his land. As we passed him, we noticed a few things. There was only one person in the truck, a middle-aged guy who never took his eyes off us, and he was talking into a walkie-talkie. A few seconds after we passed him, he pulled back onto the highway and started following us. But he never got too close. He would always get within a few cars' lengths and then drop back a little, and then speed back up again to within a few cars' lengths. We were getting nervous, and we realized how alone we really were. We had seen no other traffic on that road, and we hadn't told anyone about this great idea we had to take a detour. We checked our cell phones, and neither one had signal, which is typical for remote New Mexico, but scary given our present situation. Amy was driving and speeding up, while I frantically checked the map, hoping to find a road that would have more traffic. There was no other road. We had to travel this one to get to the next town over, Mountain Air. Turning around to go back the other way didn't seem like a good option. After a few minutes, we saw another pickup truck coming towards us. He was going very, very slow, maybe 20 miles an hour if that. The pickup was old and beat up, whereas the one behind us was newer. Amy had us at 75 miles per hour, which wasn't typical on these 55 mile per hour highways, and we blew by the old pickup truck. As we passed it, we saw another middle-aged man who was talking into a walkie-talkie. After the white pickup truck passed him, he pulled a U-turn and began to pull up behind him. As we watched this, we could see the white pickup truck guy talking into his walkie-talkie. No doubt, these two men knew each other, and we were being now deliberately followed. And for the first time, I felt hunted. They stayed right behind us. We watched for obstacles in the road, and we truly thought the old, beat-up pickup truck guys had set a trap in the road and our vehicles would be disabled somehow. We were talking about driving into fields, and we were in an SUV, but this was obviously their territory, and we were afraid of what would happen if we went off-road and got cornered. So we stayed on the highway. By now, the white pickup truck guy was right on top of us. We could see him talking into the walkie-talkie, and he stayed right on our bumper. An old beat-up pickup truck guy was right on top of him. The three of us sped down the highway. The white pickup truck inched closer. His maneuvering and edging closer made it apparent that he was trying to bump us. I watched helplessly as he got within inches of our back bumper, and Amy floored it. We were passing 80 miles an hour and edging 90. The road was flat and deserted, but if anything had gone wrong, it would have been catastrophic. We were absolutely not going to slow down or stop if we could help it. The white pickup truck pulled into the opposite lane and started to gain speed. The only thing we could think of was that he wanted to pass us to get in front. If he got in front of us, and his buddy behind us, then we'd be boxed in and trapped. We looked frantically at the rocky desert on both sides of us. Our only option was to off-road it. Should we risk it? Could we speed through the desert and make it to safety in one piece? As we topped a small incline, we saw a sign that said, Salinas Pueblo Mission National Monument, and it pointed towards a road on the left. And right at that moment, a blue pickup truck pulled out of that road onto the highway in front of us. As we came up onto the blue pickup truck, we saw the plate said, U.S. Park Service. We looked at each other and then looked behind us, and both pickup trucks did a U-turn and went the other way. We followed the blue pickup truck to Mountain Air, and then made our way to Albuquerque. I don't know exactly what these guys' intentions were, but they weren't good. There is something seriously wrong out there. I notified the state police, and they said they keep an eye on things. This area is very near Belen, New Mexico, which is where Tara Calico was abducted. It's also about 100 miles from Elephant Butte, New Mexico, which is where David Parker Ray had his little secret torture laboratory. We didn't put it all together until later. Even though David Parker Ray had died by the time this happened to us, we do believe that there are others out there who are like him, and whoever abducted Tara has never been caught. Or maybe we came into meth lab territory. But since this happened on an actual highway rather than a backcountry road, I tend to discount the meth lab theory. Whatever is going on there, One thing's for sure, it isn't good. September 2010. My boyfriend Dave, his best friend Tony, my best friend Liz and I were all coming back to our hometown for our final year of college after spending the summer in London. We had had a fantastic time, staying in my uncle's apartment, partying and exploring such a big city. It was great. We stopped in a B&B about half of the way home and were planning to get home around 6 p.m. We all woke up early, at about 4 or 5, ready to set off again, when we discovered that someone had obviously driven too close to our car and broke the right wing mirror off. Seeing as this was my dad's birthday present to me, and I'd had it barely 2 months, I was absolutely fuming. We asked the landlady where we could possibly find spares or something to use for the time being. She said she'd driven past a makeshift scrapyard or something a while back. She wasn't sure if it was still there, but she drew us a rough map and we got back on the road. I wasn't very sure she was right about her directions, because the closer we got to the area she'd circled, the more desolate the surroundings were. The roads got more difficult and had gone from stone to dirt. Around us, there weren't any farms anymore, just long, weedy grass and patches of forest. It had basically become a moor. We were about to head off because of the wild animals, and I'd just have to get over being a paranoid driver and deal without my wing mirror for this journey, when surely enough, my boyfriend pointed out in front of a handwritten sign directing us 2 miles down the road, cafe and car spares. We drove down into a little cove surrounded by forest, and all got out except for my friend Liz, who was asleep in the back seat. There was a tiny cream hut with cafe spray painted on the roof, a caravan, and a hill of metal car bits. As to be expected, we were the only visitors, and we parked up front. The sun was up, but no lights or people were around. I guessed they were still sleeping. It was about 6 in the morning after all. We all walked up to the scrap pile, and I had to fumble through looking for a wing mirror, or any sort of mirror that would do for the time being, until we could just get it repaired. Tony picked up what could be only described as at least a decade-old mirror and suggested that we just take it and go. But me, being stupid sincere, insisted to give them money for it. I can't just take it and go. I knocked on the door and waited. A big, hard-faced man answered the door, and at first looked like he was pissed off and tired, then smiled to me a two-toothed smile. He leered at me for a few seconds, then seeing the boys approach, asked us what we wanted. Tony handed him the mirror, and asked how much for it. He said nothing, just to get to know us, to which I thought was fair enough. 2 more men then left the patio doors on the other side. They turned and smiled, both skinheads with teeth like meth addicts, and they came over. They absolutely reeked. He gave them the mirror and told them to go attach it to our car. He then introduced himself as Ian, sat down on the patio chairs and offered us some sandwiches, which I politely declined. But he insisted we must be hungry and told me to come in, that women are best at making sandwiches. I declined again, finding him a little bit sexist at this point, and when he asked again, Dave more sternly reinforced that we didn't want to come in. Ian muttered something, and then came and sat on the chairs with us. It became awkward very quickly, as he started asking questions. It started off innocently enough, like how old we were, where we were from and where we were going, and then it became a little more uncomfortable. He asked if I had a boyfriend, to which Dave answered, and then started asking us both what we like to do to each other, how often do we have intercourse, and weird private stuff like that, to which we didn't answer. We sat in silence until we heard Liz scream. When we turned around, I saw one of the men, who was meant to be fixing the wing mirror back on, with his hand grasping Liz's leg. The other was looking around nervously behind the car. We got up immediately and sprinted off the patio, Tony running after the guys, but they both headed into the forest. Liz was hysterical. She'd woken up to find herself on her own in the car, and a man's hand running up her leg. I can't even begin to imagine how terrifying that must have felt. I got into the back seat with her and consoled her, while Dave came around the other side and got in, and told us some nails were on the floor. We looked over, and there were around 12 of them arranged around the tire, like the guy was ready to pop them. I couldn't really think why at the time, but now I wonder where they got all those car parts. We decided it was enough. We didn't want to spend any more time there, mirror or no mirror, and were ready to go when Tony was the last to get into the car. He closed the backseat door, and we looked back and saw Ian re-emerge from the house with something long in his hands, running towards us. My vision adjusted, and when he got a bit closer, it became apparent that he was holding a rifle. A goddamn hunting rifle. At that point I actually burst into tears and hit the engine, slamming on the accelerator as hard as possible. The car started to go, and we got up to about 90, forgetting the dirt roads and just driving over whatever, until that scrapyard was out of sight. We didn't stop looking behind us until we were safely on the motorway. To this day, whenever I go to London, I will take the train instead. I am still shit scared that I will run into them again. I live in a certain Midwest city that's infamously known and scrutinized for its gang violence. No matter how great of an area my side of town is, I can't help but be hopelessly paranoid due to all of the media and how it makes one bad neighborhood seem like the entire city is horribly crime-ridden. As a result, I'm always aware of my surroundings and always on the side of caution. I nanny part-time for a family through school. It's easy, good money, and I get paid in cash. On certain days of the week, I'll pick up the little girl I nanny, take her to our after-school activity, and then come home. By the time this is completed, it's a little after 6 o'clock, and being winter, it was already pretty dark then. Their house is located in a neighborhood that used to be considered the wrong side of the tracks. About 20 years ago anyway. You'd never guess now, due to all of the high-end retailers and million-dollar houses filling the streets. It's in an interesting transitioning phase, where one block is filled with brand new mansions, and the next block over is run down and sometimes downright scary. So even though it's getting pretty affluent, you still get your fair share of riffraff and break-ins. Anyway, I've never felt unsafe or scared on their streets. It's small and not particularly well lit, but filled with families and townhouses. Their house is located at the end of a small street, and when I reach it, I see an old man standing in the driveway. He looked lost and appeared to be checking addresses. The people who live next to my family is an elderly couple from Argentina. I'd seen the man before. We call him Vovo, but really only in passing. I asked the girl I nanny if that was Vovo standing in the driveway, and she said no. He's standing in the middle of the driveway and moves to the side when he sees that I'm trying to turn in. These are all townhomes, and it's the city, so the driveways are only about a car's length off the street. I crack my window down ever so slightly. Even if he looks like an innocent old man, I'm not taking any chances. He comes up to the car and is holding up one of those large cookies you can get in a bakery at the grocery store with frosting that reads out, "Happy Birthday." He asks me where Donna is and that he has come to celebrate her birthday with her. He leans the cookie up as some sort of proof. Confused, I tell him that there is no Donna that lives here, or a Donna that lives on the street that I can recall anyway, and that he must have the wrong address. He comes closer and adamantly tells me that this is the address that he was given. I explain to him again that he must have the wrong place. Frustrated, he asks me to get out of the car and help him read the piece of paper with the address he was given. At this point, the little girl is saying, "I'm scared," from the back seat. I grew up with stranger danger, constantly drilled in my head, and I go over the same routine with her often. We have a safe word. I make sure she knows her address by heart in case she gets lost. Never to talk to anyone she doesn't know. You know, the works. My alarms are going off. Her alarms are going off. So I slowly roll up the window and back out of the driveway without saying any more to the man. He watches as I drive away and doesn't say anything further. I turn on the next block and made my way back on the street just to check if the man was still there. Sure enough, he was, but this time a few houses down. I was still feeling odd, so I kept driving, and we stopped at a local Target, just to kind of wait out for another 30 minutes. I came back and he was gone. I assumed he had either found Donna or just given up. When I pulled into the driveway, the next door neighbor was pulling into her garage at the same time. I went out and asked her if she'd seen an old man earlier, and to my surprise she did, and our stories lined up. However, this time, Donna supposedly lived at her exact address instead of ours. We spoke to the neighbors at the end of the block, and they all shared the same story. All with him wanting us to get out of the car or our house to help him find the house he was looking for. That's when I started getting chills. What I had choked up to be a senile old man was probably some sort of decoy for robberies or carjackers. He was trying to lure us out of the safety of our car or home, and there would be someone hiding that would swoop in. As the weeks and months wore on, many robberies and sexual assaults happened within the blocks of houses. One girl was walking, and someone approached her for directions. When she let her guard down Another accomplice from behind grabbed her and raped her in an alley. I hate to think, but it was probably the same team. Once I was throwing out garbage in the dumpster in the alley during the day, and I looked up to see a man by a computer next door. Not knowing who lived there, I assumed they were working on something. Later, I found out those men were actually robbing the place, and I had made direct eye contact with them. Again, not sure if it's linked, but it's terrifying to think about. I felt awful for even talking to that old man, and putting me and the girl in danger. But nowadays it's so difficult to figure out who really is genuine, and who's asking for help, and who has ulterior motives. I guess it's just sad, the reality we live in. I always get complaints that people from the city are rude and unfriendly, but it truly is a defense mechanism. I see so much shit on a daily basis that it's safer to face forwards and not make eye contact and keep conversations with people to a minimum. Again, it's a sad reality, but truly better safe than sorry. Yesterday morning, I was unfortunate enough to suffer a power cut and spend my day in total darkness. It's not something I enjoy. I ended up wandering around town throughout the day in order to kill some time. After spending a few hours at my old university, I decided that I should get a hotel for me and my dog, as the power outage was expected to last a few days, and we live in the south, where no air conditioning becomes a big issue very quickly. I finally managed to find somewhere nearby that will book for me and my pup without costing me an arm and a leg, and that's when everything started to go downhill. I would need to get a cab from my old school back home, and then to the hotel. Everything is within a 3-mile radius of each other, and I figured it would be simple. I wasn't aware that there was a little graduation ceremony that was going on late, so every I tried to call a cab, they wouldn't show up, or someone else would take them. When the sun was starting to set, I found someone who was a previous classmate of mine, and they kindly volunteered to give me a ride home, and I packed my stuff. I called another cab, and lo and behold, it didn't feel like coming. And since Uber wasn't working at the time, I decided I would take my bag and my pup myself and walk my happy butt the mile or so to the hotel, so that she could have a good rest. I started walking, and about 1/4 of a mile of the way there, I hear someone behind me. Enter my nightmare. A 6-foot something brick house of a person, with a grisly look about them. They looked me up and down and said, "Hey, where are you going, girl?" Now, let it be known, I am new to this area. I'm from the middle of nowhere, and this is horrifying to me. I decided my options were to be incredibly polite or to run screaming, so I fell back on politeness. After rejecting him taking my bags multiple times, he stated that he was walking to the place right next to my hotel. So I decided I would try and humanize myself as much as possible to keep a dialogue between us. I mean, it's not like I had much choice. There was nothing around other than some bushes and trees, and it's not like the wildlife surrounding me was going to come and spring to my assistance. He asked me questions about my family, friends, why I was here. I made up a bit of a story, that I had a family and I was here for graduation, so that it seemed like I had people who would know I was expected. Shortly after this, he reaches into his pocket and says, "You might need this," and he hands me a small knife. Not knowing what to say, I thank him a few times, and moments later, he is talking to himself before looking at me and inviting me to live with his niece and her boyfriend. Internally, I am screaming. I know I could do nothing. This guy has at least 1.5 feet on me and I'm exhausted. We continue walking, and he tells me he gets a good vibe from me, and could see us in a relationship and with a family. He keeps muttering to himself about tons of stuff. People, girls. It was very hard for me to make out. He then looks at me and says, "I had an epiphany." "Oh," I say. He just smiled and did a head shake, and kind of chuckled to himself, muttering, "Good night, good night." I figure it's alright. We're about halfway there and I'm holding a conversation, listening to how he went to prison for 2 years over a gun and how Snoop Dogg dedicated a song to him. We get to a very dark part of the walk, and he looks at someone on the same path as us and pushes me a little bit out of the way and says, "You walk here now, 'cause you're mine, little girlie." Suddenly, people walking to their cars from graduation walk past us, and I feel safer, and I know I am home free. As we approach the hotel parking lot, he asks if he can join me. I make up some excuse about how it's only booked for one person and that it's not in my values. He follows me into the lobby. He then follows me to the front desk, and I am told I can't stay because I am 20, not 21, and they had a recent policy change. My heart sinks, and he is attached to my side, and I can't tell anybody that I'm terrified. I see a worker at another desk, and I say I'm going to the bathroom. I whisper to her, "Please, can I talk to you somewhere? I'm in a small emergency." She escorts me away, and I explain that he'd been following me from the middle of nowhere down to here. She sits me down and is listening. He's trying to currently talk to another person into using their ID for what he is calling now our room. A woman employee walks over and says, "Do you know this girl?" And he replies baffled, "Yeah, this is my girl. We've known each other for years." She looks right at him and asks my name. She's my girl. My girl. That's what he says. She tells him if he doesn't leave the lobby, the police will be called. It ended up that she is a bartender. She sits me down and ended up helping me get my room, and I fully intended to thank her and the other woman properly. After an hour sitting in the bar and her negotiating my stay, she looks at me and says, "If you wouldn't have been able to stay, I would have paid for you or taken you home, because he is still out there." I woke up next morning, and I was told that he was in and out of that place, just waiting outside. Thankfully, by the time I departed, a few days later, he was gone. I worked night shifts at a county jail for a little over 2 years, and we had some weird-ass things happening. A lot of the staff and inmates believed the jail was straight haunted, or had a presence. The stories were pretty interesting, and sometimes I'd see something weird or hear a strange noise. A lot of noises I would often write off as just an inmate yelling or doing something stupid. It is a jail after all, but there are a couple of moments I've had a hard time explaining away. One night, after we locked all the inmates down, me and another officer went and chilled in the tower, as this is where all the video monitors are located. Outside the tower is a slim hallway that circles it, the pod where the inmates stay, and the doors are secured, and the only way to get through these doors is by someone opening the door in the tower. Anyway, my buddy and I were chilling in the tower just talking about random shit. If someone isn't brought in at night, the hours are pretty slow. Then, something slams against the tower door. Both of us nearly jump out our seats. The thud shook the walls of the tower. The first thing we think is that an inmate has somehow escaped their cell and got through their pod door. Our only other co-worker was still sitting in the booking area, and we could see the camera. It was the only plausible thought. We both jumped out and pulled out our tasers. We opened the tower door, and nothing was there. I took off down one side of the hall, while my partner took the other. We both ran around the hall, and met each other on the other side. We looked around, and there was no sign of anybody else there. All pod and cell doors were secured. We both walked back into the tower and stared at each other. It was way too loud and forceful to be an inmate kicking their cell door, and we talked about it several times and tried to think of ways to debunk it, but we couldn't. For the rest of the night, we were scared shitless. There were also other occasions that revolved around seeing black shadows on the camera. I remember that me and two other co-workers were in the tower at night, and I saw a shadow on the wall of the rec room. I pointed it out, and we watched it glide across the wall, then stop, move back over, move up a little bit, and continue this for about 3 minutes. Then it went up and disappeared out of view of the camera. It was about 1 in the morning, so it obviously wasn't an inmate or anyone in there. But one of my co-workers who refuses to believe in paranormal stuff wrote it off as a bug on the camera lens. But I don't think that that's the case. Another time, we walked into the booking area and the chair was rocking back and forth like someone was in it. The next story deals with more of a crazy individual, but it was still odd. Me and another officer were in the booking area. An inmate in a cell was asking if she could have some of her stuff back, as another officer took her things because she kept kicking the door and threw her stuff everywhere. She had been compliant the whole week, and we informed her that she could have some of her things back. We gave her her tote, which had practically all of her stuff, and she seemed so thankful when we handed it back. We go back to what we were doing, and 15 minutes later, she starts screaming and cursing. We tell her to knock it off, and she screams at us to shut the hell up. I open up the window to her cell, and she's staring at me, and she starts accusing me of cursing her Bible. I tell her that I haven't touched her Bible, and she calls me a liar. We open up her cell, and she opens up the Bible and tells me that all the words are backwards. The text in the Bible was completely normal, but she had drawn some pretty weird figures in the Bible itself. I take it and tell her that she's had enough of the Bible, since that is what sparked her little episode. I look over in her cell, and she has drawn a ginormous demon head in her cell room. I yell at her for damaging property, and she starts mumbling some gibberish. My co-worker and I have had enough by this point, and she sprints out of her cell. We go after and catch her within a yard and tell her to go back to her cell. She starts saying more gibberish quickly, and it's getting uncomfortable. My co-worker pulls his taser and threatens that if she doesn't listen, then she will be tased. She starts screaming at us to do it. Now usually, this is a pretty easy way to get tased in jail, but we were both shocked because she was usually pretty level-headed and listened to my co-worker. so he hesitated and repeated his warning again. She continued to yell and scream random things at my coworker, so he lit her up. We finally got her into her cell and took her things away again. Her camera showed her standing in the corner of her cell, right where she drew the demon head. We changed the screen to a few different cameras to look at the other cells for a bit. And at about 15 minutes in, I mentioned to my partner to change it back to her camera. Her cell came onto our screen, and she was still standing in the corner. Only she turned her head, stared directly at the camera and yelled, "I love you guys," and laughed uncontrollably. This is the part that disturbed me the most. Inmates can't tell when you change cameras back to our screen. My partner and I immediately looked at each other with an "oh shit" type of look. She timed it so perfectly as soon as we checked out her cell. I've been pissed at inmates before, but never creeped out like she made me. How she was acting? She could have just been having an episode. People coming off drugs usually act strange or violently. I would have never just wrote it off as that, as I usually try to make sense of all the things. I can't explain how she followed up with the little act though. The next night, she claimed she had absolutely no memory of what happened. Okay, so a little backstory before I tell you one of the craziest experiences of mine that happened during my 2-year security career from 2013 to 2015. I am a 6'7" male in Australia, and I'd like to think that I'm a fairly tough and intimidating guy. But some of the shit that used to go on at the mall I used to work to on the night shift still gives me goosebumps. So the mall I worked at was very, very large, probably the largest in my state. And all the way up to 8:30 p.m, it would still be relatively busy. Only at 9:30 would we manage to usher all of the stragglers out, and only at 11 p.m. would all of the business owners had left. My job was basically to patrol the mall and make sure there was no one sticking around after the doors were closed during the night. We didn't have guns nor a baton, only a can of mace that was very rarely ever used. There would be multiple occasions where we would find would-be thieves hiding around trying to break into shops after dark, but they were normally far outnumbered by the 4 or 5 of us on shift at a time, and they would usually be intimidated by me or some of the other imposing members of night shift. This one night though, shit started getting really weird for me on the night shift. So I'd say it was about 2 a.m, and I was standing in the middle of the empty food court eating a sandwich. This was the only part of the mall that had any light on at the time, due to the skylight, so it was comfortable to eat there. While I was eating though, I heard a dull scraping noise from the hallway, leading off from the food courts and to some toilets. It sounded like a piece of metal dragging across the floor, and I was immediately put on edge, and I flicked my torch without hesitation. I can remember creeping down the hallway with the flashlight in hand, illuminating a good 6 or 7 meters in front of me. As I got closer and closer to the end of the hall, the noise became louder and louder, until I was at the end of the hallway, and there was the toilet doors to the right and to the left of me. I could tell the sound was coming from the female toilets though, and I gripped the handle and opened the door, a tiny little crack. The noise was now very clear, and had me not scared, but confused. I yelled, "Oi, who's in there?" The noise quickly stopped. I paused for a moment, listening hard through the tiny crack of the door. and I swear to God, I could hear low, male breathing. I shut the door, still gripping the handle tightly, and flicked on my radio. This is 1 to 3. I need help in the food court bathrooms. I think there's someone here. There was no response. This was really strange, and it put me further on edge. Policy was to always answer the radio, and now I was truly becoming quite alarmed. This is 1 to 3, does anyone copy? Still no response. I can remember whispering to myself, what the hell? I again opened the door a tiny crack. Listen, mate, if you don't come out here now with your hands up, you're gonna end up eating your teeth tonight. Do you want that? I sat there at the door, quite honestly terrified. At this point, there was no response. In fact, now there was no noise at all. I yelled into the bathroom, "Okay, mate, I'm coming for you. If you do anything stupid, it's not my fault, you'll never walk again." I tried my hardest to sound scary, but my voice was almost quivering at this point. The whole situation made no sense at all. Why would someone be in the female bathrooms? And what was the metal noise? What the hell was even going on? I very slowly opened the door and scanned the flashlight slowly across the room. All the cubicles were open. Weird. But other than that, the room was totally empty. Admittedly, I was absolutely bricking it, and I thought I was definitely losing it. I walked into the center of the bathroom, closing the door behind me. Scared to the core, I let out a faint, "This is some horror movie shit," when I heard the long, whining squeak of the door behind me. I span around, basically crying at this point, and shone my torch on a giant man, at least a head taller than me, or so it seemed in my state at the time. He was Caucasian, at least, and in his 40s with matte grey hair all over his forehead. He was mid-opening the door, but he stopped, dead still in the middle of the action. He just looked at me, smiling this guilty smile, like a kid would make when he gets caught stealing biscuits or some shit like that. I'm not gonna lie, I was so scared I froze. He lifted his finger up to his mouth. Shh, before swinging the door open all the way, and sprinting out with what looked like some small metal box in his hand. Turns out he was just hiding behind the toilet door when I opened it, and I totally missed him. I was so close to him, and I didn't even bloody notice. He could have killed me if he had a knife or something. And that thought still haunts me to this day. Later that night, my radio miraculously started working again, and I got right on telling my co-workers about the story. They collectively went pale when I told them what happened. They all had similar stories, but none as a close shave as mine. I worked the night shift for another week after that before I quit. I'm not sticking around in a job like that. I needed help, and for some reason my radio screwed itself. Why? I profoundly hope I don't meet that old guy again. I grew up in an extremely rural Midwestern state. My family lived in the country between two small towns, and I attended school in both small towns and knew most of the families in the area, either by face or by surname. One night, it was around 10 or 11 p.m, and I was leaving a high school basketball game in town. I was around 15 and driving on my school permit past curfew. I had borrowed my uncle's car, which is an early 90s Toyota, with a leak in the gas tank that caused me to run out of gas before I made it more than 5 or 6 miles out of town. and I had about 7 left to go. I was on a long stretch of road that served as a shortcut between 2 main highways in the aforementioned towns, and wasn't heavily travelled. There were a few houses, but they were stretched far apart, and at the time, cell phone reception was very spotty. I waited, and finally, a nice, newer red truck with an extended cab, a toolbox in the back, and a construction company logo pulled up. It was a Friday or Saturday night, and there was a man inside with a woman and 2 girls. He offered me his phone. I remembered noticing it was a track phone, which my friend and I at the time referred to as crack phones, because you couldn't trace the owners, and they are frequently used by drug addicts. They're also used a lot by people who can't afford a standard phone plan, but the family was driving a really nice vehicle, and they seemed super clean cut, so it struck me as odd. The phone got no reception. I tried calling my parents a few times and finally gave up. The truck had been headed away from Town B towards Town A, where I had just come from. So when they offered me a ride, I thought nothing of it. I had a gas can in the trunk, and all of my friends lived in Town A. So I figured they could drop me off at the gas station on the way to their destination, and I could find a ride back with somebody I knew. When I got in the car, I was caught off guard by the way the woman, who I assumed was his wife, and the 2 little girls, who I assumed were his children, were dressed. Conservative families, even Amish and Mennonites, but the man being otherwise modern, wearing jeans, driving a sort of flashy truck, and owning a cell phone, and the female's clothing surprised me. They all wore long, heavy skirts, with button-up blouses and thin bonnets on their heads. One of the girls seemed to have a disability, and made a grunting noise every so often. Other than her noise, the women were completely silent. Everything seemed fine to me until the man driving turned around and started driving in the opposite direction he'd been driving. The closest town the other way was still 15 or more miles, and it seemed out of his way. Out of politeness, I reminded him that I had come from Town A, knew everyone there, and could find a ride home. It was late, and I figured he needed to get his family to where they were going. That's when he told me that he was from Town B, and that he had a full gas can waiting at his house, and that he could take me there, and that he could bring me back to my car to fill it up. Still trying to be polite, I told him it was unnecessary, and my house was on the way to Town B, just a few miles away, and that he could drop me off, but he didn't reply. I started to feel like something was off. I'm from an area where people go out of their way to help others, but it seemed like too much. I had insisted numerous times that he didn't have to drive nearly 30 miles out of his way to get me gas. He could simply drop me off on his way to his destination. Or if he wanted to make sure I made it home, he could drop me off at home. In my uneasiness, I started making small talk. I asked him his name, and his last name was unfamiliar to me, which was surprising, but not totally unbelievable. Coming from a town of around 3,000 people, where I had spent the first decade of my life and where both of my parents still worked, you probably can guess that you meet a lot of people, as you bump into the same people constantly. I remembered wishing that I had paid attention to the construction company name on the side of the truck, since most company names in my area are named after a family. As we got closer to the turn-off to my house, I started to get more frantic. I realized that these people, who didn't even seem overly friendly, were insisting that we drive completely out of the way late at night in a rural community to fix a fairly common mishap. I had no idea who they were, I have never seen them before, and I had no cell phone reception, and their cell phone was undetectable. Even if it wasn't what they were trying to achieve, making me disappear would be pretty easy. I started kind of shrieking that they just dropped me off at my house, but nobody in the car seemed like they heard me. Finally, in a fit of panic, I screamed at the top of my voice, "This is my turn, take me home, please take me home right now." Finally, for the first time, the white spoke up, yelling at the man angrily and somewhat annoyed. "Just take her home." Outside of the girl's grunting, the car fell silent. He swerved angrily on my road, pulled into a driveway, and let me out, and then reversed out the driveway so fast that the tires spat gravel, and I couldn't even see the license plate or the name of the company through the dust. I ran inside and woke up my parents to tell them what happened. They just yelled at me because I was driving past curfew. I don't know for sure what the intentions were, and maybe they did just want to help, but I felt really uneasy the whole time. I grew up in an extremely rural Midwestern state. My family lived in the country between two small towns, and I attended school in both small towns and knew most of the families in the area, either by face or by surname. One night, it was around 10 or 11 p.m., and I was leaving a high school basketball game in town. I was around 15 and driving on my school permit past curfew. I had borrowed my uncle's car, which is an early 90s Toyota, with a leak in the gas tank that caused me to run out of gas before I made it more than 5 or 6 miles out of town, and I had about 7 left to go. I was on a long stretch of road that served as a shortcut between two main highways in the aforementioned towns, and wasn't heavily travelled. There were a few houses, but they were stretched far apart, and at the time, cell phone reception was very spotty. I waited, and finally, a nice, newer red truck with an extended cab, a toolbox in the back, and a construction company logo pulled up. It was a Friday or Saturday night, and there was a man inside with a woman and 2 girls. He offered me his phone. I remembered noticing it was a track phone, which my friend and I at the time referred to as crack phones, because you couldn't trace the owners, and they are frequently used by drug addicts. They're also used a lot by people who can't afford a standard phone plan, but the family was driving a really nice vehicle, and they seemed super clean cut, so it struck me as odd. The phone got no reception. I tried calling my parents a few times and finally gave up. The truck had been headed away from Town B towards Town A, where I had just come from. So when they offered me a ride, I thought nothing of it. I had a gas can in the trunk, and all of my friends lived in Town A, so I figured they could drop me off at the gas station on the way to their destination, and I could find a ride back with somebody I knew. When I got in the car, I was caught off guard by the way the woman, who I assumed was his wife, and the 2 little girls, who I assumed were his children, were dressed. Conservative families, even Amish and Mennonites, but the man being otherwise modern, wearing jeans, driving a sort of flashy truck, and owning a cell phone, and the female's clothing surprised me. They all wore long, heavy skirts, with button-up blouses and thin bonnets on their heads. One of the girls seemed to have a disability, and made a grunting noise every so often. Other than her noise, the women were completely silent. Everything seemed fine to me until the man driving turned around and started driving in the opposite direction he'd been driving. The closest town the other way was still 15 or more miles, and it seemed out of his way. Out of politeness, I reminded him that I had come from Town A, knew everyone there, and could find a ride home. It was late, and I figured he needed to get his family to where they were going. That's when he told me that he was from Town B, and that he had a full gas can waiting at his house, and that he could take me there, and that he could bring me back to my car to fill it up. Still trying to be polite, I told him it was unnecessary, and my house was on the way to Town B, just a few miles away, and that he could drop me off, but he didn't reply. I started to feel like something was off. I'm from an area where people go out of their way to help others, but it seemed like too much. I had insisted numerous times that he didn't have to drive nearly 30 miles out of his way to get me gas. He could simply drop me off on his way to his destination. Or if he wanted to make sure I made it home, he could drop me off at home. In my uneasiness, I started making small talk. I asked him his name, and his last name was unfamiliar to me, which was surprising, but not totally unbelievable. Coming from a town of around 3,000 people, where I had spent the first decade of my life and where both of my parents still worked, you probably can guess that you meet a lot of people, as you bump into the same people constantly. I remembered wishing that I had paid attention to the construction company name on the side of the truck, since most company names in my area are named after a family. As we got closer to the turnoff to my house, I started to get more frantic. I realized that these people, who didn't even seem overly friendly, were insisting that we drive completely out of the way late at night in a rural community to fix a fairly common mishap. I had no idea who they were, I have never seen them before, and I had no cell phone reception, and their cell phone was undetectable. Even if it wasn't what they were trying to achieve, making me disappear would be pretty easy. I started kind of shrieking that they just dropped me off at my house, but nobody in the car seemed like they heard me. Finally, in a fit of panic, I screamed at the top of my voice, "This is my turn, take me home, please take me home right now." Finally, for the first time, the white spoke up, yelling at the man angrily and somewhat annoyed. "Just take her home." Outside of the girl's grunting, the car fell silent. He swerved angrily on my road, pulled into a driveway, and let me out, and then reversed out the driveway so fast that the tires spat gravel, and I couldn't even see the license plate or the name of the company through the dust. I ran inside and woke up my parents to tell them what happened. They just yelled at me because I was driving past curfew. I don't know for sure what the intentions were, and maybe they did just want to help, but I felt really uneasy the whole time. This is a story of my two most memorable birthday surprises. Let me start out by saying that these events happened on my 5th birthday, with mostly my cousins, and also people who I didn't know at the time, to celebrate. Dad had invited 1,000,001 of his friends, all of them somehow knowing me and my twin. After they'd all gotten drunk karaokeing in the dining room and eating their beer bellies full, my mum thought it would be a good time to light the candles. We all gathered in our living room, about 20 people, hovering over my twin and I, and the rest sitting on the couch or still drinking in the dining room. I also should include that my dad is a domestic abuser, alcoholic, and had used verbal abuse towards my mum too many times to count during my childhood. The traditional happy birthday song began, and just as my sister and I went to blow out the candles, one of my impatient cousins decided we couldn't do it on our own. So she blew out all the candles. My sister and I looked at her, and that's when it started. "Your stupid girl blew out the candles," a voice said in Vietnamese, directed towards the father of her. "What did you say?" My dad, who was the brother of the wish thief's father, yelled at the person. "Don't talk to him like that!" And a punch flew towards the person. After that, I only remember getting hurried into my room that I shared with my 3 other sisters, and my cousins were crammed through the window that my mum opened. And then she rushed back to where the fight was to try and get to the phone in order to call the police, which was inconveniently located in the living room with them. I ran towards the open front door, wanting to be with my mum, and saw my dad ripping the wall phone from her and throwing it at the floor. Only 2 of the men there, out of the roughly 30 he invited, helped my mum. Just as my dad was about to hit her, the fight circulated outside, as all the children got in the spare cars and the mothers drove to my cousin's house only 15 minutes away. We got into the house, locked the doors, and checked if everything was all right, and separated my 6 sisters and I to try to sleep the event off for the time being. Almost everyone slept together on the floor of their living room with their mums when my cousin's mum came in and said that my older cousin, Mike, who was about 15, had decided he would be able to share his bed with one other person. My mum volunteered my twin, who had a mental handicap and might be better off in bed. That's when he walked out awkwardly, and even though I could tell something was wrong with him, the whole room suddenly stopped for a second, seeming like everyone got the same vibe. One of my older sisters, Tessa, stood up and said she would volunteer. I looked at her and saw that she looked unsure and cautious, even seeming scared. I don't know what got into me, but apparently I suddenly stood up and ran over towards Mike and stood next to him, looking excited to be sleeping with my older cousin. I must have been an expert liar as a kid, because I still get shivers around him to this day. We went into his room, closed the door, and turned off the light. I slept facing the wall, while he put his arm around me as a blanket just to my nose height. He was basically spooning me. Being the innocent kid I was, I thought this was just normal. And then I felt a hand. I knew it was an ordinary place, but it was my stomach. But then he pulled me closer, and then stuck his hand in a place I knew was not right. My eyes opened from my half-sleep, and I stared at the wall, trying to comprehend, with all the intelligence a 5-year-old could have, what the hell he was doing. I tried to scoop away from him, and by a stroke of luck, but very bad luck for everyone not in the room, I heard my dad kick open the front door and the screams of the people in the living room and kitchen. I jumped up and so did Mike, quickly jumping off the bed and opening the door. I saw my dad wielding a gun and pointing it towards my mum, who was on her knees with her head down, begging for forgiveness in Vietnamese and crying. Mike's mum saw me and grabbed me to huddle with the rest of the kids on the couch, which didn't make any sense because he actually had a clear shot of our heads. My boss of a grandma bravely went to the wall phone, which was right behind my mum and adjacent to the front door, and dialed 911. A few more moments of my dick of a dad yelling and threatening to shoot everyone later, the police arrived and arrested him by force. You'd think that my mum would divorce him and let him rot in prison after that. Right? Wrong. My mum actually bailed him out, dropped charges, and let him live back with us. Currently, I'm 15 and he's still here. Mike is still here too. He's now married and has a son, and he acts as if nothing happened. My dad is seemingly nicer, but still verbally abuses everyone who lives under his roof. It was by far the worst birthday that I have ever had. I work for my local sheriff's office on the night shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. at the county jail. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind here. This building is pretty old. So old, in fact, that my father actually started in the exact same building as me before being deputized, and my grandfather was still working for the sheriff when it was built. I've only been there for a little over a year, but I've definitely seen some weird stuff that I can't quite explain. Allow me to elaborate. When I first started, my dad jokingly told me that he'd seen more than one ghost down there in his time. I thought he was kidding, but my first week on my own, I was monitoring cameras. When I see a dark shape moving on one of the cameras where nobody could have or should have been near. So I called my partner to relieve me so that I could go check it out. I had to go through 2 locked doors to get there, and I didn't see anything that could have been what I saw on camera, and my partner just told me that I needed to relax. On another occasion, I was with my partner sitting on a post when we hear this massive bang come from one of the units. So we take off and go see what the hell is going on. And when we get there, we're greeted by a bunch of groggy, terrified looking inmates who have no idea what woke them up. But you could tell that they weren't trying to play games or anything. They were legitimately scared. This last story is the best one. It happened to me about a month ago, and my partner and I both saw shadow people. We were working on one of the booking posts, and these are people that have just been booked into jail pretty much straight off the street. My partner was coming around with me while we did a visual check of the unit. We started off on the lower tier and worked our way around when about a quarter of the way through, I catch something out of the corner of my eye on the upper tier of the unit. When I stop to turn and see a black figure that's vaguely in the shape of a person just standing there, and it looks like it's staring right at me. I grabbed my partner and just pointed. He definitely saw it too because he turned the palest colour I've ever seen, and we just stood there frozen for what felt like an eternity, before whatever that thing was seemed to melt back into the shadows. Needless to say, we had our flashlights on for the rest of the night. Something that I just want you to be aware of is that the vast majority of people who come through a county jail are good people who are just in a bad situation. As long as you treat them with respect, they shall do the same for you. That's something my sergeant told me on my very first day that has stuck with me, and in a way became my guiding principle whenever I'm interacting with people inside the fence. Now this one is something that disturbed me. The first time I ever met an actual sociopath was an interesting one. We'd been debriefed that we had an inmate who was able to resist a taser and assaulted 3 police officers. I was standing by a couple of guys who were about to transfer to our main facility, and one of them starts talking to me, and he tells me that he won't be here much longer. I ask him what he means, just to clarify, as I thought he was talking about suicide, and he tells me that his charges are going to get downgraded because they didn't have enough evidence. So I asked him what he was in for, and he described to me in the most gleeful way possible how he had been tased twice and was able to take out one of the tasers from the officer and proceeded, for lack of a better term, to beat the shit out of 3 police officers with it, sending one of them to the hospital, and the other 2 were treated by the emergency services at the scene. He then tells me that there were no other witnesses to what happened, and he thought that the DA office would offer him a plea deal with a reduced charge and penalty. Unfortunately for him, while our jail is old, we do upgrade our equipment, and we have cameras and audio recordings almost everywhere. So I just egged him on and acted very interested in his story, and occasionally would have him clarify certain things. Little did he know he was actually confessing the whole thing. After that whole situation was finished, I let my sergeant know what happened, and we pulled the video and audio and sent it to the DA's office. I'm still waiting to be subpoenaed for that. That's the most disturbing thing I've seen. Somebody that not only didn't care that he hurt people, but also seemed happy about it. Now, this next guy was brought in about 3 years ago for sexually assaulting a child, but had yet to go on trial, and was released on bond, and he was brought back in on an unrelated charge, and was a public menace for a long time before being caught. He was about 60 years old when he was booked in this time. Due to his past charge, it was decided to place him in protective custody for his own sake. While he was with us, his sexual assault trial moved forward and was over in about a month. During the course of our trial, he would tell us how they were distorting the truth in his trial, how his relationships were consensual, and we all learned that he definitely had more than one victim because he saw another inmate and described in graphic detail how, when that inmate was in high school, they would have sex in exchange for money and drugs. I try not to judge the people that I meet sometimes. The lack of remorse, though, is so sickening that I couldn't stand to be around him, and it's truly horrifying at times. There is a silver lining if you want to look at it that way. A verdict was finally reached, and in his trial, he was given a life sentence with no chance for parole. I hope that justice is enough for his victims. This happened a couple of years ago, and I still remember it clearly, as it really creeped me out. I grew up in a very strict home. My dad is a preacher, and my mother is a workaholic. So, you can imagine what I went through in my teen years, as I was very rebellious. I was into gangs, drugs, and that sort of thing. I had just gotten out of a 9-month county jail term and 6 months in boot camp. So I was very excited to smoke some weed. However, I was still on probation, but I had heard about how synthetic weed was popular and easily available. So this was music to my ears. Weed that can't be detected? Sign me up! Man, how I wish I had known the roller coaster it was going to cause in my life. Anyway, so if you've smoked synthetic weed, you know that it messes with you pretty badly. My parents started catching on, and soon I had to hide to get high. This was easy, because there was a very deep forest behind my house. I would jump the fence and walk until I found a place to sit down and smoke. After about 2 months of this routine, I was walking the trail that takes me to my favorite spot, when suddenly I heard something behind me. As I turned around, I noticed there was a man a couple of yards away walking in the same direction. I looked at him and tried to not show any sign that I had been startled by his sudden appearance. The man was tall and pretty well worn. He had crappy clothes and looked like he'd come from a homeless shelter. There was something very creepy about how he walked. The stare he had was very disturbing, and it felt like he was watching my every move. I could feel his fierce stare even when he was right behind me. I turned to look at him, and he didn't even blink, just stared. I nodded in respect and kept walking, and I had just finished boot camp, so I was ready to defend myself, and I was also very paranoid. I couldn't stand the fact that this stranger was behind me, so I turned around to look at him. He asked, "Are you okay?" in a mocking kind of tone, probably sensing my discomfort. I said, "Yeah," and I noticed that even if I slowed down walking, he was making sure he stayed behind me. I even stepped off to the side and pretended to text to watch him pass by, and he walked even slower in a very obvious way. He just kept staring at me with an evil look in his eye, kind of like annoyed that I would try to outsmart him. Or was he expecting me to run? He kept following me and staring at me. I probably shouldn't have turned around as much, but damn it, what the hell was he doing? What really bothered me was now he had his sleeves rolled up and was getting closer, like he was planning to do something. I played a very desperate move. I stopped in my tracks and said very loudly, "Did you hear that?" I pulled out my butterfly knife and just stared into the woods to the side. He suddenly stopped, and we both stood there in silence, just waiting. I turned to face him, motioning him to be quiet, and I acted like I heard an animal or something. I then shrugged it off and nervously said, probably a hog or something," and I kept the knife open in my hands as I walked. Because of all of this stalling and walking, I'm pretty in the deep woods now, but I couldn't afford to turn back now. I noticed he was keeping his distance, still staring with a very mean look. Then he was gone. I was so creeped out, I still walked with a knife and just kept checking behind me. Finally, I felt pretty safe. However, I was a bit too far in the woods that I knew if I smoked synthetic weed, I'd have to walk all the way back high. At least it was still daylight, because trust me, I've smoked weed back there at night. I know, how stupid. Anyway, I decided to take the main trail that ejects you into the far end of the neighborhood. All the other trails end up who knows where. I knew about a clearing where I was going to smoke, and then walk back to my house through the neighborhood to play it safe. As I approached the clearing, my stomach dropped. On one of the trunks was the man sitting there. What the hell? How did he beat me? But one thing really bothered me, was that he had something like an axe, and he was just sitting there. I watched him to see if he was chopping a tree or something. Nope. He was just talking to himself, rocking back and forth like a crazy person. I watched him, trying to figure him out. He hadn't seen me, so I was very quiet. My knife was no match for the weapon he had. I'd have to fight him. As all of this was going through my head, he got up and grabbed the axe and walked in my direction. I don't think he heard me. I just think it was bad timing. But I was like, screw this shit, and I took off running and didn't look back. Once I left the trail, I went into the woods to jump to my house. I ran through those woods, cutting and scraping my arms and face on the way, not caring. That incident spooked me so much, I didn't go back for a good 3 months. And I always carried something more effective than a knife, if you know what I mean. My friend has been a teacher for most of her adult life, and during her time traveling the world, meeting other teachers, and gaining a heap of experience, she has heard and worked in some prolifically haunted schools. This story is about someone she knew called Deb. In the year 1993, Deb was in year 9 at a school in a very remote part of Australia. It was March, when the days in Australia were getting shorter and the weather outside was beginning to get cooler. Deb's class and the year 8 students were enjoying a sleepover at the school. The school was called Kangaroo Inn, named after some old ruins that were nearby. The rock walls and window frames were all that remained of the old inn, constructed and used during the gold rush era. Deb says that apparently the Chinese couple who ran the inn were buried under the school somewhere, but that ultimately no one alive knows for certain. Deb was put on cooking duty, barbecuing sausages and patties for tea. And at around 6:30, some of her mates came down and asked her just how long she would be for tea. As she was cooking the barbecue, she heard a dog barking. Now there were no dogs at the school, and she could hear the barking coming from inside. She was about to investigate when a little dog, a Jack Russell, popped out of the wall, and it ran around barking, then headed over to the tech studio's room, and ran through that wall into the room. This was no child's imagination. One of the teachers who was staying with the children on overnight came out to find the dog he heard barking. Deb told the teacher what he saw, and the teacher replied, "Well, the school is supposed to be haunted, but not by a dog." When they heard her barking again, they all ran to the other side of the tech studies building, and to their astonishment, the dog was standing half in the wall barking. We couldn't see his tail nor his hind legs, Deb recalls. While we watched, an orb floated out of the glass glowing green. The dog followed it, barking it constantly. By this time, 3 other students and one other teacher were witnessing the phenomenon. The dog and orb floated up into the air and were lost from sight in the darkening skies. She said that she'd never seen anything like this, but some year 12 students supposedly caught a video footage of a green orbs earlier, around 1988. And also, some teachers reported being shaken on the shoulders or felt cold spots when locking up the school late at night. When sleepovers or events at school happened after school. So I guess my old school was haunted, she said. But whatever was happening never hurt anyone, just freaked us out. On another occasion, she was working in a boarding school in 2006. And this is the story of one of the girls who attended. It was the first year of school, but one of the best friends had been there for 3 years and had already had a number of spooky encounters. For example, one day when she was walking past the stairs that led to the 2nd floor, she heard what sounded like a boy laughing, and she could hear these footsteps ascending the stairs. To investigate, she went up to the stairs and looked down into the hallway, but she saw nothing. She decided to check the rooms upstairs, but she saw and heard no one. When Christina's friend returned to her bedroom, she glanced in her dresser mirror and saw a little pale boy standing there, and who then proceeded to sit on her bed. But when she turned around, he was gone. When Christina came into the room, her friend told her everything she had. She described the little apparition as having a blonde-haired, pale-faced boy who was wearing a striped shirt and faded blue pants. Christina says that she believes her and that she wanted to see the ghost boy. So, if we could sit at the bottom of the stairs for about an hour every day. I had nothing after about a week, and so we gave up. 2 weeks later, however, Christina had her own encounter with a ghost. One morning she had just gotten out of the shower and went into her room to put her shampoo and her towel away. She opened up the closet to hang her towel on the door, and she says that when she was about to close the door, she saw him, the little boy, exactly as she described. She knew the dorm was used to be a hospital, and that had a lot of sick people in it. But they said that the room my friend and I are in. She says the dorm used to be a hospital, and had a lot of sick and dead people. They say the room that her friend and her were in is where a little boy died of pneumonia. I remember as a child, my mother would tell us about creepy and strange experiences she would have in Mexico when she was a little girl. But a story that definitely stuck with me was a story that belonged to my stepdad. Long before my parents even met, my stepdad was previously married to his ex and mother to their baby girl. My stepdad would wake up very early, at about 4 or 5 a.m, to tend to cattle and horses. One morning, as he was getting ready to leave for his work, his ex-wife got up to prepare him breakfast and pack his lunch. Their baby girl named Frances also woke up. She was very much attached to her father, so my dad showered her with attention before putting her down and giving her a kiss as he was getting ready to leave for work. But before he left, he asked his then wife to keep an eye on the baby and make sure the doors were closed and locked after he left. She nodded, but went to lay down with Frances. Eventually the mum fell asleep, but the baby didn't. She was over a year old and managed to get down from the bed and out of the room in search of her father, but didn't find him anywhere. So she walked towards the front door, and obviously the mum forgot to make sure it was locked and secured, and Frances managed to open the front door and walked out of the house. This is where things get really strange. A friend of my dad's recalls hearing what sounded like a child crying. It was so early in the morning and still dark outside. The noise obviously scared him. He grabbed a thick wooden stick and walked closer to investigate the noise, when he saw a little child. As he walked closer, he realized it was a familiar face. It was Frances, walking barefoot, all alone, looking scared and lost. He picked her up and took her to my stepfather's house. He explained how he found her walking alone, crying, near the river they had that separated some of the houses. This is the weird part. The river is long and strong, as well as deep. When my dad's friend had found her, her clothes and hair were dry, and she had no signs of having been in or near the river. But the only way she could have made it across the house would have been by crossing it. The child was very visibly shaken and scared, and wouldn't stop crying, and soon stopped eating after. She developed a high fever, and no doctor could figure out what was causing any of it. One of my dad's friends went to see a witch doctor and asked him to do a reading on the little girl. The witch doctor had told her that Frances had been touched by el espíritu malo, or the evil spirit, and that he would require 6 red altar cloths and a few other ingredients to get started on helping the little girl. My stepdad's ex-wife didn't believe a word of it, as she was a complete skeptic and thought that it was all a bullshit scam, a way to trick them into getting new supplies for himself. He urged them to reconsider, but she ignored it. The witch doctor then told them, "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but if you don't bring me her back, along with the list of supplies I gave you, she will pass away at 7. My stepdad tried convincing her to take back the baby, and that they would find a way to get all the materials needed to start the healing ritual. But the mother refused. The next day the baby was weaker, and still burning up from her fever, and at exactly 7 p.m, Frances passed away. The dad remembered something else which the witch doctor had told them before they left. He remembered him saying, "When the baby dies, flip her over and inspect her back. There you will see the print of the evil spirit." My stepdad recalls picking up his little daughter's lifeless body and turning her over. There he saw a red handprint visible across her back, just as the witch doctor had predicted. To this day, my stepdad believes that whatever was with Frances that night guided or carried her over the river and did something to her that she could not recover from. All I know is that every time I hear this story, my heart aches for this child that was just looking for her father, but ended up finding something far more dark and sinister that early morning. When I was 16, I had an experience I will never forget. I am a very skeptical person, even with the experiences I had through life. So even telling this story still makes it seem surreal. There's a bit of background story, but since I don't want to just puke out my life story, let's just say that from a very young age, my life was constantly filled with negativity. And I believe everything that's happened before this experience definitely had something to do with it. I was friends with a group of people who practiced Wicca, and it was something I was interested in, so I learnt a lot from them before this happened. It is a beautiful craft, and so open and welcoming. There were more experienced, as they had a few years' worth of practice before I even entered the picture. Anyway, on Halloween, we went to pay our respects to those who had passed, and so we decided to cast a circle in our local cemetery. The circle was cast by an angel statue that had been built for the children buried in the cemetery. Now normally, the door to the circle is closed, but we left it open to invite any spirits to the offering. food and drink. My friend Kate went off in her own to speak with someone who had just died months before, and my other friend Meg and I stayed in the circle, both silent, as we did our own thing. I was upset, and already at a vulnerable point in my life, as I was dealing with depression from the death of my father. He had committed suicide when I was 6, and I wanted some peace. I wanted to hear from him, and understand how he could leave his family like that. I opened the door even wider. A rush of wind came into the circle and knocked Meg over onto her butt, landing in her black mirror, breaking it, which means bad luck. She was spooked by it, but I didn't experience anything. It was completely quiet. She told me to go to Kate, so I stood up and told her to come back to the circle. She was reluctant, but came back with me. When we were all in the circle, Meg told Kate about what happened, so we started picking up the food and other things in the middle of the circle so we could officially close it. I can't explain to you what it feels like. The best way to describe it is like something is invading your space. It's uncomfortable, and it's almost like it's trying to shove you out of the way and make room. I literally felt like two different people, and the invader was trying to gain control. Meg noticed I looked different and asked if I was okay. I didn't answer her. And then I crouched on the ground, my nails digging in the dirt, and I was swaying back and forth. And before I knew it, I turned away from them, threw my head back, and let out an ear-piercing high-pitched scream that lasted for about a minute. After the scream slowly died off, I started shaking and turned to them, and I remember saying, "Something's wrong." And they grabbed me by the arms and kept me still, and started saying a Wiccan prayer. I tried saying it at first, but I literally growled before I could finish a sentence. I felt like I had no control. I felt hatred and anger, but I kept on trying, and eventually I could say it, and began to feel like a weight had been lifted. We closed the circle, went home, and that was it. We didn't talk about it. I laid in bed thinking I should have never have been in a vulnerable state like that, and that I would be strong. I imagined a white shield surrounding my house and my stealth, and I started working more with energy and stepped away from any type of religion, focusing more on the spiritual. Not because I don't like Wicca. I just knew I had to change. I never told my mum or any of my friends. It was just two of them and me. Was it a demon? Who knows? People think demons are the only things that can possess, but when a spirit has enough energy, there's a whole lot more they can do. So nothing extravagant. No speaking in tongues or throwing people twice my size. Just something that ended quickly, but changed my life and my perspective forever. I grew up in upstate New York, about 30 minutes north of Syracuse to be exact. I only made sense that I would return to my quiet part of the world after I got out of the Marines in 2007. The only problem is, I didn't have much money. The good news is that my grandfather had an old pull-behind camper that he told me I could have until I got on my feet. So, being on my own, I decided I would spend about a year in the pull behind, on a few acres of woods that I had bought from a friend while I was in the Marines. Taxes had been paid for the year, so the only thing that I had to do was pay for gas and propane. I managed to avoid looking like a crazy mountain man by showering and washing my clothes at a local truck stop and diner, and even got a pretty decent job working security. I filled the rest of my time working odd jobs for extra cash. Alright, now on to the main story. It was mid-April, and I was sitting next to a nice low fire while listening to my battery-powered radio and watching night fall in the woods. I had gotten a nice dinner at a nice diner down the road, and I didn't have any work for the next few nights. Generally, I didn't see anyone in the woods for a few weeks at a time, so I wasn't expecting it when I heard a scream break the silence. I shot up and grabbed my shotgun out of the small camper and checked the chamber to make sure it was loaded. I stood at the edge of my small clearing and strained my ears to listen for any new sounds. It's generally hard to pinpoint the direction of a noise out in the middle of the woods at night. Luckily, I had heard someone shouting and car doors slamming, so I knew that the sound had to be coming from a main vehicle trail a short distance from my campsite. I made my way to the trail as fast as I could in the low light, and before I could get halfway there, I heard another clipped scream to my left. I could hear a rustling in the brush, and I slowly made my way over to where I thought the noise was coming from. I came out of the woods right next to a man who had a woman pinned to the ground, and another leering man standing just behind him. Shaking from adrenaline, I leveled the shotgun at the guy on top of the woman and growled at him to get off. Now I'm a big guy, but I have no doubt that the shotgun was the deciding factor in this whole situation. Each of these guys had a solid 30 pounds of muscle on me, and I was a 200-pound Marine. I ushered the two idiots back, and I was between them and the woman, who was now getting to her feet. It was about now I realized we had another problem. My cell phone was cheap and didn't get reception in the woods. Hers had been broken by these two sickos. There wasn't much I can do other than march these two back to their shitty, lifted Jeep under the threat of shotgun. I got their license plate number, names, which I was sure they faked, and description of them and their vehicle. Before the driver got in the vehicle, I lowered the shotgun to his crotch and made sure he understood what a 3-inch 12-gauge shell loaded with a buckshot can do to a man's genitals. They took off in one direction, and me and the woman made our way back to the campsite. We drove to the DEC station as soon as possible and reported the entire incident. It turns out the guy I hadn't threatened was the young woman's now ex-boyfriend. They had all been out having a few drinks when the third wheel in the situation got a little too handsy for her liking. When she said something to her boyfriend, he basically told her to stop being so stuck up and to put out for once. When she refused, the boyfriend took her phone and smashed it on the ground. They both then pushed her into the truck and drove her deeper into the woods. She had waited for them to become complacent before throwing the back door open and jumping out of the Jeep and taking off. Luckily, the Jeep was a pile of shit, and the back door didn't lock. It was also a stroke of luck that I happened to be outside when she managed to escape. Fast forward about 7 months, and that woman I helped became my wife, and we moved into our first house using the money. I had been living in the woods to save up, and we've been married for 8 years now and have 2 kids, a 6-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. I still go out to the camp every year to hunt, and I haven't seen the Jeep or the potential rapists again. We heard throughout the grapevine that they have been arrested, but somehow got off without actually any jail time. I'm assuming they moved either into a city or further away, because we haven't seen them again. So to the 2 potential rapists in the Jeep, I know who you are, and for your sakes, I hope we never meet again. When I was 13, we had a huge German Shepherd, who was 7 at the time. This dog was a beast. He wasn't afraid of anything, ever, constantly following me to school and waiting for me to come home, at the foot of our driveway. All around a great dog. Again, let me re-emphasize, this dog wasn't afraid of anything. Anyway, we bought this house that we were living in at the time for super cheap, because the previous owner had hung himself in the downstairs coat closet, and it wasn't selling fast enough. One day, I walked down the stairs to see my dog staring at the closet. Just staring. So, he's standing up, tail between his legs, and isn't moving an inch. Just staring at it. The door was open, which was weird, because people in my house are usually good at closing things up. I go over to Rodney, my dog, and try to see if there's something in the closet from where he's looking. I can't see anything, but the closet is super dark. And I tried to snap Rodney out of it, but he won't budge. He just keeps staring and staring, and I'd never seen my dog like it. The most horrifying part? Rodney's head is moving slightly from left to right, like he's following the movements of something hanging in the closet. Also, there's another story that happened when I was younger, and happened when I remember feeling fear. I've also had other encounters. The first that I can remember happened when I was around 8 or 9. I had this group of friends that always hung out together, and stayed at each other's houses and generally had a good time. Well, we decided we were all going to stay at my friend Eddie's house that night. Everyone had clothes, and the necessities except for Jake, whose house we never stayed at, because of the stories that he told us. He lived in this old white house, with these steps that go more vertically than horizontally, very steep, and very shallow steps. He would tell us stories about how things would bang on the walls near his bed, and he would hear things running up and down the hallway at night. Being the badass he was, they never seemed to bother him or his mother. Now it was decided he needed to get his shit together, so we have one of the parents drive us over there. Not even the parents wanted to go into the house, and I realize now that he sends us all up to get the stuff. So we go in, and we're all near the middle of the stairs going up to his room. At this point, we hear what sounds like someone running from the basement up the stairs into the hallway. So we all book it the rest of the way. I was the last in line, and just as I was heading to the top of the stairs, I heard it round the corner, where we were all currently running. I looked down and saw nothing, but I heard the spirit start running impossibly fast up the stairs. We got inside the room as it got to the top, and it ran down the hallway, and again we saw nothing. So we were all standing in his room, as he gathers his things, and no one was particularly freaked out by what had just happened, which was odd. I'll just chalk it up to being young and naive, or just plain stupid. I was quietly walking around, checking out all the guns and knives he had in his room, when suddenly the lights go off, and I hear the door slam. I turned pale white, and whipped around and noticed all my friends had snuck out and left me. I quickly ran over and ripped the door open. As I took my first step out the room, I heard the Sprint similarly run out one of the rooms and give chase. I got to the top of the stairs and I took 2 steps and realized I would never make it down quick enough. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I jumped, hit the ground, rolled and sprinted for the front door. I heard the spirit run back down towards the basement just as I neared the front door, and I saw my 2 friends laughing, preparing to hold the door closed from the outside. Normally that may have worked, as I was the youngest and the smallest of the group of friends, but not this night, when I had adrenaline surging through my veins and more anger than the Hulk. I had the strength of 5 small 9-year-old children, and I didn't even slow as I neared the door. I simply reached out, twisted the knob, and shoulder smashed the door and sent my friends sprawling. Reliving this tale has sent adrenaline in my veins. A few years later, my friend and his mum moved from the house and had it demolished. It was one creepy house, that's for sure, and I never did go back there after that first time. A few years ago, I was hiking somewhere on the border of Montana and Idaho. The exact location escapes me at the moment. I was with my uncle, and the hike was something like 6 miles in and 6 miles out to a lake. Keep in mind, this is a very remote area. To even get to this place was about a 20 to 30 mile drive into long dirt/logging roads. There were no other cars, and we didn't see anyone else on the trail for the entire day. On the hike, we noticed a makeshift camp set up along the trail to our right. This was by no means a designated camping area. It just happened to be enough of a clearing to pitch a tent and have a small area to walk around in. The camp looked somewhat disheveled, and there was nobody in immediate sight. We continued on the lake, ate lunch, and headed home sometime late afternoon. On our way back, the camp was now on our left. Now that we were heading in the opposite direction, the camp came into view much sooner along the trail than it did on our hike in. It was a few minutes until we actually reached this camp, and I had a very eerie feeling now. From this direction, I could now see that the tent flaps were unzipped entirely. I found this strange and scanned the camp for residents. By the time we reached the camp, nobody had appeared, and I decided to yell out if anyone was there. Maybe to say hello. Maybe to see if anyone needed help. I just had a strange feeling that something here was very wrong. At this point, my uncle was very much freaked out and was trying to continue walking along without incident. I yelled over 3 or 4 times towards the camp, each time walking closer and closer to the tent. I got no response. I stood a few feet away from the tent and scanned around the hills, and there was nobody in sight. The camp looked exactly the same as it did in our hike in. Upon further inspection, I could see a few items strewn about on the ground beyond the tent. But my first stop was definitely going to be the tent. I thought for a few seconds and pondered exactly what I may find. I was scared of waking someone, but more scared of finding someone who may not be able to wake up. I crept closer, my uncle reluctantly following me about 10 paces behind. I yelled a few more times, but no answer, and I pushed aside the flap, and there's nothing but a sleeping bag, laid out perfectly as if someone had just unrolled it. Keep in mind this is a very nice tent, perfectly assembled too. Nice vestibule, spacious and sturdy. It struck me as odd that someone with such a nice tent would have been so foolish to have left their tent unzipped, so I stood and scanned the area. This tent was a few 100 feet away from a very small water source. There were various items, as I said earlier, every 50 feet or so, and I noticed a Ziploc bag on the top of a boulder right next to the stream. I headed over there and found that it contained several strips of uncooked bacon. Again, strange. My thoughts were racing, and I had an overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I put the bacon back where I found it and looked around again. Nobody was here. We hadn't seen anyone all day, and this camp looked exactly the same as it did in the morning. Who in their right mind would leave a bag of bacon sitting right here? Who would even bring bacon into a place like this? And how? There was no ice chest, not even a car. Why would you bring food like this into an area where there are mountain lions and bears? There wasn't even a stove or any other cooking utensils in sight. This was a very barren camp. My thoughts began to slow down as I looked to my feet, and I saw several shell casings and several rounds of a .45 caliber handgun. This was the icing on the confusion cake. My uncle insisted we leave immediately at this point, and I agreed. We hiked rather quickly out, counting paces, and I calculated that the makeshift camp was about 1 mile from the start. I still have no idea what could have happened at that camp, and it still freaks me out, but makes for a very scary story.